Today is November 27th, 2004, and this is an interview with Bob Wermuth. Mr. Wermuth is 87 years old, having been born on August 20th, 1917. My name is Sean Murphy, and Laurie Wermuth and I will be the interviewers today. Grandpa John, could you state for the recording what branch of service you were?
I was in the United States Navy.
What was your rank?
Lieutenant Commander.
Where did you serve?
I served in both the Atlantic and the Pacific.
Do you remember the day when you were drafted?
I was first commissioned in May of 1939.
And could you just explain the difference between being commissioned and being drafted?
Being drafted is an enlisted person. A commission is an officer. There could be male or female officer.
And does that mean that you became an officer voluntarily for World War II?
I went through 4 years of Navy ROTC at Northwestern University, and in May of 1939 was commissioned as an ensign in the U.S. Navy Reserve.
How do you feel about being commissioned?
Oh, it was what I wanted. That's why I took the Navy ROTC course at Northwestern University, because I wanted to be a commissioned officer in the Navy Reserve.
How were your 4 years of college?
Oh, excellent. Very enjoyable. And each year we had a course which was taught by naval officers or naval non-commissioned people. And then after the freshman and sophomore and junior years, we took 2-week training cruises that left from the Atlantic coast to either Boston or New York, and went generally to the Caribbean, and one cruise went all the way to the Panama Canal Zone.
What happened after you were commissioned?
Then I was a reserve officer subject to being called to active duty, and I was called to active duty in April of 1941 as an ensign in the U.S. Navy.
What happened then?
I was assigned to the Naval Training Unit at Saginaw Bay, Michigan, and the whole unit was, after 3-4 months, was transferred to man a ship called the USS Terazed, which was a United Fruit Company ship, which was a reserve ship for the Navy and was activated at that time. And the entire unit from Saginaw Bay was assigned to the USS Terazed. And the Terazed we loaded up, took 300 boxcars to load the ship, and we traveled to different areas where we supplied the Navy. One of the places we went to twice was Iceland, and we went to Reykjavik and then went up the Valfjord, where the ship was anchored for about 3-4 weeks, and we would provide supplies to the U.S. Navy ships, to the British ships, and to the U.S. Air Force. And when we were out of supplies and emptied the ship, we would travel back to Bayonne, New Jersey, and reload, and then go back to Reykjavik, Iceland. Reykjavik was a midpoint for the Atlantic convoys. The U.S. Destroyers escorted the convoys out of the East Coast, either Boston or New York, and as far as Iceland. Then the the British Navy escorts came down out of Iceland and Reykjavik and would take over the escort of the convoys. The purpose of the escorts was to provide safety against submarines.
What was your job on the ship?
I was an assistant navigator and also served as the duty officer when we were underway in 4-hour shifts. We had 3 officers assigned to the bridge area as I say, we were on 4 hours, off 8 hours, on 4 hours, off 8 hours, until we got to Iceland, and then coming back from Iceland after the ship was unloaded, we'd go back to the East Coast, and the ship would be reloaded for the next trip to Iceland. I don't know if I said it, but the supply, yes, I did say it. The supplies were not only for the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Army that was stationed at Reykjavik, and also for the British Navy.
And how did the escort ships protect the destroyers from submarines?
Well, the escort ships had sonar gear, which would send out signals in a pattern, searching for any submarines, and if they got it would be like a radar taking it would ping off of a metal object and return to the sonar gear, which would the sonar man would scan the pings he's getting to see if it was just something in the ocean or if it was an actual submarine.
And did it happen that you ran across some submarines in running these trips to the north?
No, we didn't. We were one of the few convoys that got to Iceland without losing any ships.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I mentioned that the British ships would take over below Iceland and take these ships into England. And then going the other way, the American ships would American destroyers would take over from the English destroyers and escort the convoys to the United States ports. They would, the convoys passed, I recall, about 150 miles below Iceland. And so the escorts would go up to Iceland when they completed their duty, and would refuel and then be ready to take the next convoy. So the British escorts took them as far as Iceland, and then the American escorts took them from Iceland to the United States, various ports. Could be Bayonne, New Jersey, or Baltimore, and I think one time Halifax.
You said you were a navigator on the ship?
Yeah, I was an assistant navigator on the ship, yes.
What did an assistant navigator do?
Well, in taking sun shots, star shots, or in order for the determining of the angle of the sun or stars or whatever. We would we would each take the same shot and compare, and then we'd help in computing from the readings on the sextant. We'd compute how to weigh it out on the chart, which would show you're crossing lines, which would then identify where the ship was. It was, compared to today's navigation with the GPS, it was old world. But it was done, for instance, back in the time of Columbus.
Fairly accurately.
Fairly accurately. The problem was that if you didn't have a clear horizon, you couldn't get a shot, an accurate shot. And we also would, if you had a horizon, we also would use the moon to get positions. What happens is you convert from what your instrument shows to a line onto the chart, and where these lines cross would be an indication of where you were. Mm-hmm. And we would, by taking a couple different, two different navigators taking shots, and they'd compare lines to for accuracy. And that's basically what the navigator did in ocean transport. When you're near land, then you did differently. You worked off of lighthouses or boat buoys or other points that you could be identified.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you learned about in college, navigation?
Yes, but on this first ship I was on, the navigator had been the captain of the ship as a commercial ship, and he had all kinds of shortcuts to do the computations, and you could do them in about half the time that the Navy taught you.
How many men would be on one of these escort ships?
Well, okay, I may have confused a little bit. On the first trips to Iceland, I was on a transport.
Oh, okay.
At a supply ship.
Oh, excuse me.
We carried 300 boxcars of food. In the forward hold, it was dry food. In the middle hold, it would be fresh things that could be carried a long way, like potatoes and carrots. And then in the aft holds, it was frozen meat.
And how many men would be on a transport ship?
We had about 300, because in each watch you're basically at what's called general quarters, in other words, ready for battle. And so there were many more people on watch than what was necessary just to navigate the ship.
Mm-hmm. 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 And did those people get to know each other fairly well during that trip?
Oh yes, yes. Yeah, and over a period of time they may be together for 3, 4, 5 years. So as the lower level officers and non-commissioned enlisted men got experience, they would be transferred to other ships. In the early, this was before the war was declared. It started in April '41, and of course the war started in December 7th of '41. So we a lot of the ships were used to begin to train people. And we had more people than what we needed, but we used the time for training people. And they would be assigned to newer ships.
Are there any memorable events or relationships or other things that you would like to
I think the
describe?
most memorable one was that in one we went from the U.S. ports to Reykjavik, Iceland, and then back again. And in one convoy going back, we came down from Reykjavik, joined the convoy, and then we're headed back to the United States. And one, they did not have the GPS or that type of navigation on. In one instance, this 50-ship convoy hit extreme fog, and it completely broke up. The ships the next day were spread all over the ocean, and the escorts had no way to keep them together because they didn't have the radar capability that we had later on. At that time, England was just developing radar. So the ships were on their own once they, when the fogs lifted the next day, they were all over the ocean. They did what they could to regroup, but basically they went on their own back to the U.S. ports. That was the worst mess. It was one of those things without the radar, because at that time we didn't have radar.
Mm-hmm.
So the ships, the way the convoy formed, would be about 36, 40 ships in the convoy, and each the ships in the convoy, not the escorts, were a mixture both of Navy ships and of merchant marine, but mostly merchant marine. And each ship had a light that showed up their wake, and so the ship behind could see that foam, mm-hmm. And be able to keep their proper space behind the ship. And it was a very, compared to having radar, it was a very difficult thing to, particularly when you hit bad weather.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Do you remember the day that the war was over?
The war was over. Well, there were two wars over. For one thing, now you skipped out to where being the Pacific, and we had the war with Germany was over, and then the war with Japan was over later on. Yes, I should say that I was on the USS Terazed. I'll go through the ships I was on. I was on the USS Terazed from June of 41 to January of 42. Then I was on assigned the USS Dauntless, which was Admiral King's flagship, and we at that time that I was assigned, it was the Dodge yacht, and it was owned by the Dodge family, and it was taken over by the Navy and converted into a flagship for Admiral King. So that was the second ship I was on, and I can't remember these dates.
Did it start in January 42 when the Terazed service ended?
well, there was an in-between one.
Okay.
I was on the Normandy, assigned to the USS Normandy, which was really the French ship, the Lafayette, because the French were taken over by the Germans. We took over the French ocean liner called the Lafayette, and it was being converted into a United States troop ship called the Normandy, and it burned, had a fire at the dock in New York Harbor, and burned and was destroyed and turned over. I lost everything I had. And so I was on the Normandy there for about 3-4 months. And then from there I went to the USS Dauntless, which was Admiral King's flagship, and it was berthed. It was in Ecorse, Michigan, being transferred, being made from the Dodge yacht into his flagship. And we sailed it from Detroit to Washington, D.C., where it was berthed in Washington, D.C. It was, I don't know, I never could understand what it was, because it was, we really had no gun power, and Admiral King never did go aboard it, and it was taken out for cruises just to keep the crew used to handling the ship actually in the harbors. So I did not like that duty, so I asked, I requested transfer to the Sub-Chaser Training Center in Florida. And I was transferred there and went through 3 months of training. And then I was assigned to the captain of the SC-647. It was just a 120-foot wooden escort ship, not very well equipped. We used to escort from Key West to Galveston, and Key West to New Orleans. After that ship, I was transferred to the USS Temptress, which was a English-built corvette. A little history. Before the war, when England was involved in the war with Germany and having so many ships lost to the German submarines, Roosevelt gave 50 destroyers to England to help in escorting convoys. So when we got in the war, England gave us 6 corvettes, and that was the USS Tempest. We escorted, they're used mainly for escorts along the Atlantic coast. From the Tempest would escort convoys again from New York down to the Windward Passage, which is the passage between Haiti and Cuba. And then we would go into Guantanamo Bay down there and spend 5 days there refueling, and then we would go back out and escort. The convoy route went all the way from New York all the way down to South America, but the escorts could not go that far, so they had to change escorts in the Windward Passage off of Cuba. So we would escort. We'd be part of the escort of a convoy going to as far as Cuba, and then we'd go into Cuba and then pick up a convoy coming north. We would relieve the escorts that started down in South America. There were a lot of major minerals that were being obtained from the South American countries, and so and other things that were. And so they, because the German submarines, they had to escort from South America to the Windward Passage off of Cuba. And then those escorts would go into Guantanamo Bay, and we would come up from Guantanamo Bay and take over for them and escort the convoy up to New York. Interesting sidelight, and I can't remember exactly why. We did some escorting to Halifax, and we happened to be in Halifax when the war started, December 7th, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So the captain got me out of the bunk and made me, the executive officer got me out of the bunk and told me to go ashore and tell the captain the war had started. So they took me over in a little boat over and told the captain, he said, I know all about it. So that's where I was when the Japanese attacked. And lost my train of thought.
You had, for some reason, been on an escort up to Halifax when the war broke out.
Yeah.
And was that before this specific experience that you were describing?
Oh yes, yeah.
That was early, when the Americans joined the war.
Yeah.
1941.
Yeah.
December 7.
Yeah.
So there was your Atlantic experience and then your Pacific experience.
Okay.
Where you were was you had described 5 different ships, I believe, 5 or 6 different ships. I have 5 down.
Well,
the USS Temptress.
The USS Temptress I was on for 18 months.
Okay.
First I was executive officer for 6 months, and then I was the commanding officer for 12 months. And from there I was then transferred to the Pacific, and so I flew to Chicago, planes didn't go cross country then. Flew to Chicago and I had to leave, 3 months leave, so 3 weeks leave, so I stopped and saw my mother and family in Chicago, and then went the rest of the way to the San Francisco, and picked up the USS Temptress there. Let's see, From when I was on leave, I went, when I was transferred from the East Coast, from the Temptress, and as I say, I stopped in Chicago, saw my family, and then went to San Diego, and there I was transported on what's called a Jeep carrier. A Jeep carrier is actually a Kaiser built a few hundred ships, and some of them they made into Jeep carriers. They had a small landing deck, but mostly they're used to transport planes. And so I...
Like small fighter planes?
Yeah, small fighter. And so I rode that one of those ships. I don't even remember the name. I probably got it written down at home. Took about 3 weeks to get out to the Pacific to Guam. And at Guam, then I picked up my destroyer escort, the USS Emory.
You want to take a little break? Have
Yeah.
a rest?
I gotta think.
That was a lot.
Oh, well, the trip out to Guam on this Jeep carrier was great. They had the Jeep carrier was used because they didn't have enough of their large carriers, and they used them a lot for just transporting planes out on both the hangar deck and the flight deck. When we went out, half the flight deck was empty, so we used to play volleyball every day. The ship was had good enough weather, and the ship was stable enough that we could play volleyball.
A little warmer in the Pacific.
We were just being transported, so we didn't have any real duties. And when we got to Guam, then that's where I picked up the USS Emory.
What role did you play on the Emory?
I was the commanding officer of the Emory.
Okay.
And we operated out of Guam. I'll just name a number of the ports and then tell you more about. We went to Saipan, the Manus Islands, and many islands that we just anchored at. We would escort ships there in the Pacific. Most of our convoys were small. Sometimes we'd only escort one Navy supply ship, for example, or sometimes we at Iwo Jima. I had command of the escorts. We had 3 escorts, and we escorted 6 ships to Iwo Jima. This was about 3 weeks after Iwo Jima landing. And there was no harbor at Iwo Jima, so these ships were supply ships, bringing supplies to the, all kinds of supplies, food, ammunition, and so forth. And we had 6 ships that we were escorting. There were 3 escorts, 6 ships. We would go to the eastern side of Saipan, and during the day they would unload some of these ships. Then at night, because there was no real harbor, there was no protection there from submarines, every night we had to escort the ships out. We would go out for about 3 hours and turn around and come back, because we could protect the ships, having sonar gear and so forth. We could protect the ships better that way. there were sitting ducks when they were sitting alongside Saipan, where there was no harbor there, no protection.
So this destroyer, the USS Emory, was prepared to do battle to protect those ships.
Yes, we had of course, depth charges. That was the main thing. Mm-hmm. We had was nicknamed the Hedgehog. They would, see, depth charges you drop in a pattern, and some would go off at 50 feet, some would go off at 150, and so forth and so on. You always had a pattern. And you had K-guns that shot some out to each side, and then you had two racks in the stern of the ship that you would roll off depth charges. These were depth charges that would go off when contacted, Mm-hmm. And we'd have a regular pattern that was laid out for, depending on how deep the water was and so forth, you change the pattern. Kind of lost track.
Well, on the USS Emory, the ways that that destroyer was able to protect these transport ships using depth charges, and also they had something called a Hedgehog.
Yeah, the Hedgehog shot missiles ahead in front of us, over the bow of the ship, well ahead, and they would only, depth charges would go off at a certain depth, but Hedgehogs would only go off if they hit something. Mm. We never did fire them, thank God. And I'm rambling, I guess.
No, that's fine. And so you didn't have to actually do battle on the USS Emory. You just successfully escorted the ships out to sea. And
that's yes. We escorted ships from
Guam,
Saipan to Guam to Eniwetok to Kwajalein. Those are called there's the Marshall Islands and the Gilbert Islands there. And we escorted them from the Marshall Islands. That would be Eniwetok, Kwajalein, and escort them to Guam, mainly. And then from time to time, we would, when there was a sub scare that maybe a plane spotted a Japanese sub someplace in the general area, they would send us out to patrol the area, and the chances of finding a sub would be very poor, but the fact that you were patrolling the area would tend to keep the subs moving out of the area. But they often would send a Japanese sub near Guam, I think hoping to catch a ship coming out of Guam. But so we then one assignment we had was the three of us escorted some Army transports to Ulithi. Ulithi was the largest atoll out there in the Pacific. It was huge. And we would escort different types of ships to different places. There in the Atlantic, where you had large convoys. In the Pacific, more mainly there were small convoys that we were involved in. Maybe 3-4 ships, that's all. There'd be 3 escorts. And we'd, many cases, in fact, in the Pacific, we never tied up to a dock except in Hawaii. You anchored out in the various bays, Uethi, Saipan, Guam, so forth. And you had to, it was interesting because you had to fuel from they had fuel barges anchored in the harbors. And it was an interesting thing in handling a ship. Due to the trade winds and or the tide, these barges would keep going back and forth, back and forth. And if you're trying to go alongside one to fuel, it was a real trick to get the ship in there and not get banged up. And it was a lot of fun.
How long were you on that particular ship, the USS Emory?
I was on the Emory till the end of the war. Mm-hmm. First, we had the end of the Europe War, and then in July, the Pacific War ended. Oh, we were sent back from Guam to San Francisco. There's a Navy in the bay, in the northern part of the bay, there's a Navy yard, shipyard. Mm-hmm. And we were sent there to be modernized for the attack on Japan. They were going to, like we had quadruple 1.1, with battery quadruple 1.1 anti-aircraft, and they were going to take that off and put on a modern 40 millimeter and do a lot of modernizing. But the war ended before that was finished.
Mm-hmm. Was that Alameda? Is that
no, it isn't Alameda. It's north of Alameda a little bit. Mm-hmm. I've forgotten the name of the shipyard. It's been a shipyard there for the Navy for years. It still exists as far as I know. Mm-hmm. They do major overhauls and major upkeep for the ships. Yeah.
It's up the Delta.
Yeah.
Sacramento, somewhere along the Sacramento Delta.
I don't know. It couldn't be too far up because of the depth of the water.
Oh, maybe it's in Marine.
If I look at a map, I could show you where it is.
Okay. So now we are kind of to the end of the war. Do you want to describe what happened and traveling back home, or anything else you'd like to describe from this last period?
Yeah, I think, as I said, we were in the San Francisco Bay, and I can't remember that area. We're being modernized, and of course, at the end of the war, they ended that, and then they got prepared. We had to prepare for decommissioning the ship, and I got all that started And a lot of the crew were transferred because we didn't need a whole crew just to decommission the ship.
And what's involved in decommissioning a ship?
Well, it's if they're going to keep the ship, it's involved putting the machinery to bed in some way. Like we had. Can't think of the word. We had electric. Our destroyer escort was driven by electric motors. So you had diesel engines that drove generators. The generators made the electricity for the electric motors. And each screw, or propeller shaft, had two motors, electric motors that drove the propellers. And so you could, for a top speed of 20 knots, you could use all four motors. And it all starts with the diesel electric, so they never can get away from the oil or gas, because they have the diesel electric to drive the generators. And generators make the electricity that runs the engines. And then they had a small one that made the ship's electricity. One of those ships could could provide the electricity for a city of 25,000 people.
How did you feel about the war being over?
Great. Great. And we had the ship tied up where it was going to be decommissioned and everything, and time went on, and finally I went up to see the Admiral and told him that, I'd been on active duty since before the war, in April of '41, and asked him what's the chances of getting relieved and put in the inactive reserve. So he said, okay. He said, you got an officer there you can take in charge? I said, sure. And so he eventually got my papers back to transfer me back to the Great Lakes Naval Station. And that's where I was then transferred back to what they call the inactive reserve. I wanted to stay in reserve. So.
And what was that date? Roughly that the war ended and you asked to be made inactive reserves again?
February 46. February 46.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
What do you think?
We'll just pause for a minute, let you just relax for a minute.
I mentioned Guam before, and my first, after I took command of the Emory, my first assignment came during the night, and we had to get underway and go out through this dark harbor, crowded with ships, and go out the anti-submarine gate with very little light. At the gate to the harbor, they had submarine nets across, and then they had a little boat that controlled the gate, opening and closing the gate. And we had to get over there without hitting anybody because he had a submarine scare, and we had to go out through that gate, and it just seemed so narrow that it had lights that shone down on the water so you could see your sides and so forth. And that was fun, kind of having to take the ship out like that. I liked handling the destroyer escort. Was totally different from handling the Corvette. The Corvette was single screw. And see, with twin screws, you can have one going ahead, one going back, and twist the ship real easily, made it easy to dock and so forth. With a single screw, it's a right turning screw. So when you like when you're at the dock, you turn the screw, it tends to take the stern into the dock. So you have to kind of release the lines in the bow of the ship, and then you kick it into reverse, because reverse would pull you away. But you can just do so much because it depends on what's next year. And then you kick it in reverse to get the stern away from the dock. And then you kick it ahead. And the first kick with the propeller doesn't drive the ship ahead. It drives it to the side or one side or the other. It depends upon if it's reverse, it'll take you to the left. If it's going ahead, it'll take you to the right. So that was always fun when you had a single screw ship. And the Temptress was a single screw ship, and we docked at Staten Island. That was our regular home port. And Staten Island is kind of in the Narrows. And the tide would run about 6 knots. And it would be hell if you had to come in and try to dock when the tide was running real strong. It was really I really learned a lot about handling a single screw ship with that. As you had to, that tide, you had to play I call it the tide, but it's it's the result of the tide. You have the water.
The current?
Current, thank you. That's right, the current running against you one way or the other. And so it was real tricky getting into, and there was not a hell of a lot of distance. There had these docks, and there'd be corvettes and different ships tied up on both sides. And it'd be tricky to get into your spot without hitting somebody or hitting the dock. And we always hated to have to dock or even go out when the current was running real strong. There's a lot to ship handling. A lot to it. Mm-hmm. And,
when you were put back on inactive reserve, did you go back out on ships where did it go from there?
I signed up for a 2-week cruise. I think the second year I was out because I wanted to stay active reserve. Then they started up a Naval Reserve unit in Rockford, Illinois, and I took command of that, but that was just a short time because then we moved to California. And so when I got to California, I joined the inactive, I was still in the reserves, but there were no active spots in Long Beach, so I went on inactive duty there and went to the sessions. I think they were, I don't remember, once a month, I guess. Then eventually, after about, I don't know, about 1952, I guess, Eisenhower told all the services to clean up all their inactive reserves and discharge ones that were not taking any active. So at that time, I was discharged, and that was okay. I had small kids. Mm-hmm. And during the Korean War, I was a little concerned I might get called up, but it didn't. And one interesting thing we had to do with the Corvette, they wanted to know what happens when you drop a depth charge that explodes at 50 feet and you're in shallow water, like maybe 70 feet or so. So we had to, in New York, outside New York Harbor, we had to go out and drop a depth charge. It exploded at 50 feet. Of course, it knocked out all the generators. They go right back on. But didn't do any damage to the ship. Mm-hmm. And that's what they wanted to know. Funny little things that occurred during the time.
A little research.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and then my most famous trip on the Emory, we had to escort a Navy supply ship down to Manus Island, and that took us across the equator. And I'd never been across the equator, and there were a few other people who had not been across the equators. So we, gosh, I think I have the pictures in the car. We got inaugurated by David Jones into the, whatever they call it. Anyway, it's you get painted and harassed, and it's just a lot of fun that the crew has. Mm-hmm. Particularly when they get the captain, they love it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have just a little bit of time left, so Sean, you're going to do a closing.
Well, thank you for being a part of this Veterans History Project, and this concludes our interview.
You're welcome, and I hope it's been of some interest.
Absolutely. Very interesting. Thanks.